I'd like to welcome Dr. Lisa Gunter, who's going to be talking to us about emergency fostering during the pandemic, takeaways for a post-pandemic world. Lisa Gunter is a PhD as well as assistant professor at Coastal Carolina University in the Department of Psychology. Before beginning her graduate studies, she worked for nearly a decade with dogs in animal shelters and with pet dogs and their owners. The goal of Lisa's research is to better the lives of companion animals and their owners. To this aim, she has investigated the breed labeling of shelter dogs, their breed heritage, shelter housing and social interactions, temporary and long-term fostering, short-term outings, behavioral indicators of welfare. I could go on and on and on. Lisa has done so much amazing work. Under the mentorship of Clive Wynn, Lisa earned her master's in 2015 and her PhD in 2018 as a graduate student in the Behavioral Neuroscience and Comparative Psychology program at Arizona State University. I will turn it over to you, Dr. Gunter.
Thanks, Sheila. I just wanted to say hi to everyone out there. In fact, one of our co-authors, Emily Blade, is in the audience. Hey, Emily. Just wanted to say hi to everyone. And of course, if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask. I think it's fun when you have questions, and I'm happy to answer them to make sure that, we're riding along on the same train together. So as Sheila mentioned, this presentation is about the work that we did on emergency fostering during the pandemic. So this was some work that we carried out in 2020. Of course, it went on longer with all the data analysis, but this was done in 2020, the first few months of the pandemic. Let's get started. Okay, so kind of a little bit of background, right? I feel like anyone that's on this call, maybe I just need to get rid of this slide. I feel like we all know these things, but just kind of circle in and be in the same place. Why are we interested in these questions? Well, I mean, if we take a step back and think about dogs and animal shelters, each year, millions of dogs are entering animal shelters, and we have thousands of shelters across the US. I read recently from Shelter Animals Count that like around 4,000 brick and mortar. So a lot of folks doing work to help animals across the US. And for those of us that have been in the field for a while, things have changed, and overall they've changed for the better. We see that dogs often being rehomed, returned to their owners, and it's a small proportion that are being euthanized. And I think that, those of us that work in sheltering, we're looking for ways to help those animals that can be helped, which is why we have these research questions and why we do the work that we do. So for those of us that are working with dogs in animal shelters, visited an animal shelter, any of those, we understand that dogs' daily experience in the shelter is likely stressful, certainly stressful compared to a home. And we can think about all the myriad ways that the shelter is stressful, right? We can think about excessive noise, right? The noise levels in shelters. This is probably one of the most kind of well-studied features of the shelter that could be challenging is excessive noise in kenneling areas. Several studies have found that the noise levels in shelters are higher than what would be recommended by OSHA, exposed ears in an 8-hour workday. So it's no surprise that we are sensitive to the issues of noise, but there's other challenges in the shelter as well, such as restrictions to dogs' movements. We see the dog here in his kennel, and he's kind of not able to do those species typical behaviors. We would hope for dogs to be able to do, exploring their environment, even roaming around or interacting with other dogs. And with that, we have that sort of social isolation in the shelter, right? I often think about how dogs are surrounded by like 100 of their best friends, but can't necessarily interact with them. Maybe best friends or not, who knows, but a lot of dogs around them, perhaps, that's something that they've never experienced before. But there's also the social isolation from us, right? That I think we play this outsized sort of role in dogs' lives. And even in the best shelters where we get to spend a couple hours with them each day, taking them for walks or providing opportunities for enrichment, there's probably over 20 hours a day that they're on their own. And so that certainly plays a role in their welfare. And then the last two that I think are worth mentioning are a loss of control and a lack of routine. So that routine, I mean, there is a bit of a routine when people come and when people go, but certainly not to the level, or there's not that unpredictability of people and dogs walking by that, compared to dogs living in homes. But I think that loss of control is a big one. And I think probably Sheila's had Michael Hennessy on her insights as well. And I think, he's talked about this in his work as well, is this, you think about this doggo here in the photograph, and, the things that he had done in his life previously that perhaps would get him interaction with people, such as being, given some soft eyes, soft body, and being that wiggly self that he is, would likely elicit a reaction from a person that would involve petting, right? And that social action that he's interested in. But imagine in the shelter, that might not be the case. He does those same good moves, and people keep on walking by. So I think it's all of these sort of aspects of the shelter, and these are just a few that make life a bit challenging for dogs. So what can we do about that? Well, as we've seen, human interaction is one of the most well-studied, consistently effective interventions in animal sheltering. Just so many studies that have looked at whether it's 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or even our own work, where we've looked at the effects of 1 and 2 nights and temporary fostering. And in fact, kind of the sort of quintessential human interaction is foster caregiving. It allows dogs to leave the shelter and escape all those environmental stressors that I mentioned before. And in our work, as I just referenced, we've seen that stays of 1, 2, and even 3 nights of away, that's some work by Feringer, has been shown to lower dogs' cortisol levels. And a sneak peek, so does a week-long fostering. We haven't published that yet, soon, but so we can see that getting out of the shelter and spending time with people is beneficial. So with that in mind, we have the COVID pandemic, and in March of 2020, the WHO declared the coronavirus outbreak a worldwide pandemic. And we saw that in March and April of 2020, 90% of states across the US, or parts of states, had some sort of stay-at-home order in place. And that was in an effort to curb the spread of the disease. And along that time, then, with all these folks staying at home, so many folks were there at their house. They're not traveling, and not even able to physically interact with folks that weren't in the same house as them. So that situation, it's not a surprise that these were just some of the media reports about shelters, right? We're overwhelmed with inquiries about fostering and pet adoption. We see NPR, the nation's dog supply chain has been broken during the pandemic, and that adoptions and sales were soaring during the pandemic. In fact, some places here, we have the Washington Post reporting that there were so many pets being adopted out that shelters were running out, and that we were seeing surges. At least this is what was being reported, right? That there were surges in animal adoptions and fostering. And I think that this is sort of a really interesting situation, right? And I think I'm motivated by research questions that are about real life. And in here we had, the media reporting that, wow, there's so many adoptions, there's so much fostering. Is that really the case? And I think that's the great thing about science, is that we can kind of pull back opinions and maybe anecdotal reports and see what the evidence says about the phenomenon in question. And so, in the study that I'll be chatting with you all today, we explored utilization of foster caregiving at 19 shelters across the US. And this was during the first 4 months of the pandemic. Not only did we look at how foster utilization occurred, but we also looked at qualities of the shelters and the caregivers that were related to the shelter's utilization. And of course, we were looking at those outcomes of dogs that participated in the foster programs. So with that, I think you all may have access to this already. This link may have been shared, but all of this work that I'm going to be talking about today has already been published in Frontiers. There's a great special issue on reimagining animal sheltering, support services and community-driven sheltering methods. And this paper is there. It's open access, so you can download it and read it and really get all the nitty-gritty on this study and all the details that I might not be able to dive into today. So do we have any questions before we jump in, or do we just want to get to the good stuff?
I don't see any questions in the Q&A, and I don't see any hands raised, so I think we can keep going.
Awesome, fantastic. Gosh, got to get to the good stuff, right? Everyone,
Yes.
let's get to it. So how did we kind of draw this sort of evidence? Where do we get started? Like I mentioned, we worked with 19 shelters across the US. I'll talk a little bit more about them. And we collected data with them. This represents data from March through June of 2020. So there's a couple different ways that we looked at the data here. And one of them was just on the number of dogs fostered and the types of dogs that were fostered. So we had over 2,200 dogs that were part of this data set at fostered dogs. And that includes dogs, so those that are over 8 weeks old, underage puppies. That was sort of our distinction, which I know we can all draw the line somewhere, but that's where we drew it for this study. And then we also included dogs that were being fostered by potential adopters. So that's how we got to that over 2,200 number of dogs. But we also looked at foster experiences. And so this allows us to not only see it kind of from the dog's perspective, but also the foster caregiver's perspective. And in that way, we had over 2,500 foster experiences that were part of this data set. And again, those are primarily dogs. So those are doggos over 8 weeks, and then some puppy fostering. And then again, we have nearly 900 foster to adopt experiences. So we can take a look at the fabulous shelters that helped us out in this research. Absolutely, we could not do this work without our partner shelters. And you can see that we had a wide range of shelters in our study, right? That we have not only from across the US, but we have different organization types. We have those that are private nonprofit, that's the PNP. We also have municipal shelters. And then we have those that are a combination, that they are a private nonprofit, but they also have municipal contracts. So we have a collection there, as well as the admission type of the shelter, whether it's open, managed, or limited. And then lastly, we have shelters just of very different sizes. And so you can see that there's that sort of canine intake number from the previous year. That'll give you a kind of a sense of how many animals in the community were being served, or how many dogs in the community were being served. And then you have, by each shelter, we have the number of dogs that were fostered and the foster experiences that each shelter contributed to this data set. And so one of the things that we want to mention is that certainly the shelters that were participating in the study, they had great live release rates already. While there was certainly a range from 67 to almost 100%, 99.8, but most shelters had a live release around 94%. And virtually all the shelters that were partnering with us on this study, they had some sort of dog fostering program in place. And so we were very interested in this question of what degree was their foster program in place prior to the pandemic, because we were interested in whether or not that influenced perhaps how many dogs they were able to foster. But we found that it was quite hard to sort of quantify, or even sometimes qualify, what makes a sort of just a program, or what makes a department, or how many folks were working in the department, a lot of part-time positions. So in the end, we found that, again, most of the shelters had some sort of dog fostering program in place. So a bit more about the shelters. As you can imagine, with a bunch of animal behaviorists in the room, we were certainly interested in what shelters were doing on the behavioral side of things. And we found that slightly over half of shelters were conducting some sort of routine behavioral assessment with the dogs in their care. And in addition, over half, nearly 60%, were gathering some sort of information about the dog's abilities with other dogs. And it was mostly done with either one-on-one interactions, a combination of one-on-one and group interactions, and then a small proportion were doing interactions with just dogs in groups. And then lastly, over half, nearly 60%, did not have any behavioral personnel on staff. And I mentioned this, it's a little bit tangential to this question of emergency fostering, but for those of us that are doing any type of work in sheltering with regards to behavior, just kind of having a better understanding of what shelters are doing, I think is helpful to inform best practices. Okay, so what more can we talk about? Well, we can talk about shelters' sort of adoption procedures during the time. Well, we had nearly 90% of the shelters that were in our study they did not require that all family members were meeting the dog prior to adoption. In fact, a little over 20% of shelters required any meetings between the resident dog or dogs in the home and the shelter dog that was going to be coming into their home. In fact, over 3/4 had no meeting requirements whatsoever prior to adoption. So most of our shelters in this study had, more open adoption policies, just to give you an idea of kind of how they were practicing on both the behavior side and on the adoption side. So then who are the dogs? Oops, sorry, do we have a question?
Yes, a quick question. I believe, isn't there some research that looked at requirements of meeting and how that influenced success? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that was sort of a little bit of how we started asking those questions. I'm kind of not sure on the exact study you're alluding to, Sheila, but with regards to like why we were asking this, we were sort of curious if there could be any sort of connection between dogs being able to get along with other dogs in the home, and how that might influence their foster caregiving. And also, with regards to like reporting of behavioral issues, that was sort of like maybe amongst people in the home, that was kind of what was driving those sort of questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I was referring to Emily Weiss's study. I can't remember when, that showed that there weren't more returns when meet and greets weren't required.
Yeah, and we're actually, so some of this data I should mention is that we also did questionnaires by foster caregivers with regards to their foster experience. That's some work that's being done by Rachel Gilchrist that hasn't been published yet. And so we had some questions around that about like kind of the experience they had at the shelter and how that might impact the foster caregivers experience. So kind of more on that, but nothing right now. But yeah, we're curious about kind of all aspects of that foster experience. Yeah. Thank you.
And we don't have any other questions, so we can keep going.
Good. I love being interrupted. Thanks, Sheila.
You're welcome.
So then who were these dogs then that were participating in our study? Well, we had roughly an even split among male and female dogs. And not surprising, we find these age and weights across many studies we do are pretty much the same. We find that dogs in our study were a little over 3 years of age, and they were a little under 40 pounds. When we take a look at how dogs were coming into the shelter, we see that most were transfers. So they were coming from some other welfare organization. We see then a little less than a third were strays. And then we have a combination of owner surrender and return. We separated them out here. Sometimes we put them together. Sometimes it can be hard to tell depending on the shelter's policies. And then we have a small proportion, about 4%, that were cruelty cases. So one of the things that we looked at is the dog's length of stay. And we found that the dog's total time in the shelter, so these are all the dogs that were in our study, they spent on average about 43 days in the shelter's care. And when I say shelter's care, I mean the organization's care, the total time spent with that organization. And what we found is that of those like 43 or so days, that dogs spent slightly less than half, almost 20 days, in the foster home. And so that's sort of interesting to kind of just see, because again, we in our data collection, we tracked the amount of time the dogs were spending in the shelter prior to foster care, their time in foster care, and then their time after foster care back in the shelter if that occurred. So just kind of getting an idea of these things that, perhaps like on a bigger level, we may not be looking at, but we can again look at this data from 19 shelters to try to understand how dogs' time in the shelter and foster care is apportioned. So one of the questions that we had when, I kind of have that up on the side, who were the dogs? So we kind of want to know, what were their needs? What were dogs that were going into foster care? What were they like? And what we found is that about 20% of dogs that were going into foster care had some sort of continuing behavioral need. And I know that is incredibly vague. And we kind of left it open-ended to the shelter based on that shelter and what they thought was a behavior need going into foster care, which there's a wide range, and that range can kind of sometimes be, dependent on the level of experience and expertise of the foster caregivers, and also the types of dogs that the shelter regularly helps out. So like we said, about 20% were dogs that had some sort of continuing behavioral need. What we had reported, though, was that despite, like I said, the over, 2,200 or some dogs that were part of this study, we only had about 15 bites reported. And I'm the first to admit this is just reported, but which is a little over 1% of all foster experiences. And those were roughly split amongst incidents that were involving other dogs and people. But interestingly, bites more often were happening with dogs that didn't go into foster with identified behavioral needs. So those 15 bites were more often occurring with dogs that, there was nothing that was identified prior to foster care that they might need some additional help. Any questions on that?
No questions, but unless someone's entering them right now, but I do find that very interesting because my experience adopting out dogs with behavioral needs is that exactly what you talked about, bites more often with animals who didn't, and my idea was that I prepared these people for so much and things didn't happen, and it tended to be the people who weren't prepared and didn't know where things happen. So that's some really interesting data. Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great insight, Sheila, that, and the other thing too, is that of course we have so many dogs that are going out to foster care that didn't have identified needs, right? 4/5. So you kind of have a bigger proportion of dogs going out to foster care that don't need extra help, that could be contributing to that. But I do also, I agree with you that I think that there's this expectation setting that happens, and people are prepared. And sometimes when things do go sideways, it's often because folks weren't expecting it. So, but yeah, a little bit about the doggos. And then when we take a look at the foster caregivers, we wanted to kind of understand who was actually fostering during this pandemic. You kind of go back to those media reports and we see, dogs are flying off the shelf. So, well, who's doing the flying off the shelf, right, with the dogs? And what we see is that, how we looked at this question, I'll back up a sec. How we looked at this question was that we characterized caregivers in two different ways. In one of two categories. We said, you're a newly recruited member of the community providing foster caregiving. And so that's someone that's never had, kind of been involved with the organization before as either a volunteer, just a new person coming in and helping out for the first time. Or our second bucket, which is they had some sort of prior relationship to the shelter. And that's either a staff member, a returning foster caregiver, or a volunteer that was on site shelter that then decided, hey, I want to give that foster caregiving a try. What we found was that over 40% of foster caregivers were fostering for the first time with that animal shelter. And that's I think that's pretty exciting. It has some interesting sort of implications about recruitment and this time. We had over a third had previously fostered. So again, a smaller proportion, but certainly not insignificant by any stretch. And we had 13% of caregivers that started fostering during the pandemic, and then they went back and fostered again, which I think that they're a really interesting set of folks to help us understand perhaps how we retain foster caregivers. And then we had a small proportion that were volunteers, but we're trying out foster caregiving for the first time. So that's kind of our sort of mix of who was participating, again, to try to give us insights about perhaps how we can recruit in the future. A little bit more about those foster caregivers. We found that foster caregivers on average were 36 years old. And we found that when it came to puppy foster caregivers, that they were more likely to have dogs in their home, nearly 60%, than regular dog foster caregivers. So again, kind of thinking about who are the demographics that are more likely to be foster caregiving and what their homes may look like. And if we think about either types of these fosters, whether it's a puppy foster caregiver or a dog foster caregiver, that if you were foster caregiving, nearly half only had one dog. We can kind of look at the breakdown here that I provided here a table from the paper, and I'll walk you through the table. So it's a little less intimidating and more sense. We can make more sense of it. But see on the top here, we have the number of resident dogs in the home. And so we have 0 dogs, 1, 2, 3, or 4 plus. And then what we have reported underneath those number of resident dogs is the percentage of foster caregivers that either said they had 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 plus dogs. And then we also have the number of foster caregivers, either puppy or dog, that made up those proportions. And then we have it broke down by the caregiver's relationship to the shelter. So we had folks that, like I said, that were that had no prior relationship to the shelter, and those were what we would call our new community members. And then we have what we called folks, again, I talked about this in the last slide, that had a prior relationship. And that could be a shelter volunteer, a returning community member. So that was somebody that was new during the pandemic and they came back for more, a returning foster caregiver. So that could be somebody that had been fostering prior to the pandemic. Or had been a foster caregiver and came back. And then we have our staff. And then we have a tiny proportion that were finders and owners that, kind of didn't fit into any bucket. And there were not that many of them. But we can see, just taking a look at that number of resident dogs, that many of our foster caregivers, that having 0 dogs was the majority, right? We can take certainly with the new community members, which kind of hold on to that because there's some more interesting data about those folks had no other dogs. But we also see it too with our shelter volunteers, our returning community members, less so with our returning foster caregivers, and certainly with staff. They definitely have some of the highest proportions of 4 plus dogs. But we can kind of have an idea of like who is foster caregiving and perhaps how we can go about recruiting. Any questions about that? I think there's a lot of really interesting data in there that like we're not necessarily always reporting, that I think just kind of some interesting tidbits in there.
Super interesting. We don't have any questions, but just a reminder that you can raise your hand or enter a question into the Q&A area.
Fantastic. All right. So the next thing we have is why did foster care end for the dog that was being fostered? And so we have here kind of, I'll walk you through these. The reason why foster care ended broke it down between puppies and dogs. So on the left-hand side, we have adoption. So that dog was either, it was going back to the shelter immediately to be adopted, or an adoption occurred. And then we have behavioral. And as Emily's here listening to the presentation, we went round and round about how do we define behavior. And so behavior is related not only to the dog being fostered, but it could also be related to resident animals. And it was a little hard. We tried very hard to try to figure out, well, who was kind of instigating the behavior. And I think it was very hard sometimes to determine. So if it was a behavioral reason why the dog or puppy wasn't working out in the home, that was that category. Medical, and that is just medical from the foster dog. And then we have some sort of caregiver related reason why foster care ended. And so that might be, something like travel, a change in schedule, something that was related to the caregiver. Could also be, something related to their resident dogs and having to care for them that wasn't behavioral. And then lastly, we have a scheduled return to the shelter. And you all can kind of see here, oops, I'm going to save on that one, that we can actually, I'll save here for a second. Sorry about that back and forth. That we can see that scheduled returns to the shelter overwhelmingly were puppies. And of course, right, that makes sense that if puppies are going out to foster care and until they become of age, and then they return to the shelter to be put up for adoption, that we're going to see a big proportion of that. But we can see that in fact, the majority of dogs were returned to the shelter. Their foster care ended because they had an adoption, which I think is pretty fantastic. And then we see that followed up in much smaller proportions by reasons ending for caregivers, for the caregiver themselves, or a scheduled return for dogs. But again, a much smaller percentage than with puppies. But one thing I want to point out here is that we have over 17% of all behaviorally managed foster experiences ended for behavior reasons. Conversely, those dogs that weren't going out with behavior issues, they were only being returned in 5% of foster experiences. So for those of us in behavior that are figuring out ways to support the dogs that are going out into foster care, I think this gives us some pretty interesting information. And I'll talk more about it, about how we can support people when foster caregivers, when dogs that have some sort of known behavioral issue are placed in foster care, because we see here that perhaps those foster experiences might be a little bit more challenging, and figuring out ways that we can better support people. Any questions on that? For the behavior people in the room that are, love the behavior stuff.
I don't have a question on that, but I do have a question related to whether you kept track of how many where foster care ended in adoption, whether the adoption occurred from the home versus going back to the shelter.
I have some data about the adoption in a few slides, so we can chat about it then, as well as some of the findings we had about perhaps length of stay and where that adoption occurs. So
thank you.
Yeah, of course, love that stuff. So here's then our main question. We wanted to know about shelters' utilization of foster care in the pandemic. So how do you go about figuring that question out, especially when you have shelters that are of very differing sizes? So to detect whether foster care increased during the pandemic, we measured utilization in an interesting way, which we called the foster utilization ratio, good acronym FUR. And we answered that by saying, let's come up with this ratio, which is simply the number of dogs in foster care. And I say simply because it was not simple at all. It was a huge undertaking. The number of dogs in foster care, and that being divided by the number of dogs in foster and shelter care combined. So all the dogs in care in that denominator, and the number of dogs in foster care in the numerator. And so this required then for every shelter that we worked at to know every single dog that was in care. And that happened, and we calculated this ratio on a daily basis for each shelter, starting from the start of the pandemic through June. So every single day we were counting how many dogs were in the shelter and how many dogs were in foster care, and keeping track of all of those dogs across the 19 shelters. And so this data then that I'll show you next is based on the average utilization of foster care on a monthly level. So we took those daily, the daily FUR ratio for each of our 19 shelters, and then we averaged it on a monthly level. And what we found here is not surprising. Just 1 month into the pandemic, from March to April. So we have March, April, May, and June across the x-axis, and then foster utilization ratio on the y-axis. We saw that shelters had a significant increase in foster utilization between March and April of 2020, just like the media reports, that just 1 month in, they were sending way more dogs, and dogs were living way more dogs were out in foster care than living in the shelter. But I think what y'all are seeing here is that by June of 2020, foster care utilization had returned to similar levels as at the start of the pandemic. So I feel like a little disappointing. We wanted it to last longer, but we kind of dug into this question of, well, how did maybe the type of organization influence their utilization, right? Did different types of organizations utilize or have different experiences with their utilization of foster? And what we found is that municipal shelters, by and large, were much more quickly to return to those initial pandemic levels of foster care than either type of nonprofit, whether they were a private nonprofit or a private nonprofit with contracts. That we see here that we have our overall levels from March, April, May, and June. That dashed dotted line is overall of our three different types. But you can see that with our private nonprofit and our private nonprofit with contracts, that they kind of ramped up in April and then slowly came down in May and June to those, like I said, near pre-pandemic levels. But that was not the case for municipal shelters. They had a big increase. And in fact, some shelters reported increases of over 200% in foster care, which is just so fantastic. But we see that then from April to May, that comes down quite quickly and then sort of plateaus in June. And one thing I want to note is that, within this data, this ratio, and we have this in the paper, so we're very transparent about this, that certainly if shelters are taking in less dogs, then it's possible that there's less dogs coming into the shelter. And so that ratio then can be manipulated by simply the number of animals coming into care. But I think that this is, again, just sort of some interesting information about how shelters utilized it and how that could be sort of different depending upon what type of organization they were. Okay, so then what about the outcomes of the foster dogs and puppies that were part of this study? Well, we're happy to report that over 93% had some sort of positive outcome. Either they were adopted. Oh, was there a question, Sheila?
Yes. Oh, it looks like it was just answered. It was,
Okay.
is that because folks were closed and avoiding animals from coming into their shelter? So yes, you did answer that. Thank you for the question.
Absolutely. And feel kind of dig into that. For whoever asked that question, we dig into it just a smidge more in the paper. So if you do want to read that, feel free. So what do we got here then? Our outcomes for all the doggos and puppies that were part of the study. Like I mentioned, we had over 93% that had some sort of positive outcome. And that was including adoption or transfer to another agency, which I know some folks, what does that mean? But we included here as a positive outcome, as well as being returned to their owner. And even when dogs were remaining in care, which were only 5%, and this was at the end of the study, right? So track them all the way through these 4 months. And then what was the outcome of those doggos, that even if they were remaining in the care of the shelter, that they were doing that in a foster home. So that's pretty fantastic. And we had less than 2% of all those over 2,000 dogs that were experiencing foster care. Less than 2% had some sort of negative outcome. And that was either they were lost or care, were euthanized for behavior, which is barely less than 1%, or barely less. It was a little over 0.5%, and the same for medical. So I think those negative outcomes, I think were really minimal compared to the really fantastic positive outcomes. And even dogs, even if they're remaining in care, at least during this time during the pandemic, they were doing that in a foster home. One of the very interesting findings we had is that 73% of dogs that went into a foster to adopt, so that's some sort of temporary or trial adoption program, nearly 73% of them were adopted by that person. So, I mean, huge sort of takeaways there about the impact of these types of programs and the success of these programs. So programs like foster to adopt, they're, as the name sort of implies, they are ending in adoption. But that's not really the case for foster care. We found that only 7% of underage puppies being adopted by their caregivers, which is quite low. And we see that 18%, which is, still a good number, almost 1/5 of foster dogs were being adopted by their caregivers. So again, I think some interesting sort of data here to kind of guide our expectations about how a foster caregiving experience may end, and what we can do with this data to kind of have what is that likely outcome, and act accordingly.
Lisa, I've heard that some organizations don't allow their foster caregivers to adopt the dogs. Do you know the policy of the organizations in the study?
Yeah. Oh, that's pretty interesting. That's a good question. I have to be honest. I don't even know if we were like, oh, that's a possibility. I'm sure we tracked it, but by folks with like Emily and the other folks that were doing day-to-day data collection. I'd have to follow up on that to see what the individual policies were of the 19 shelters. We certainly, as you can see here, kind of coded it as an outcome, but I don't know if some of the shelters may have not allowed it, which may have impacted the percentage of those that were being adopted by their caregivers.
Yeah, hopefully not.
Yeah. Oh, Emily has her hand raised. In fact, maybe she can help us answer.
All right. Let's unmute Emily.
So just to my knowledge, nobody had an explicit policy that the fosters were not allowed to adopt.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Emily.
No problem.
So a little bit more, because I think that this is, and I think our whole team, this was some pretty juicy stuff about, well, let's dig into more about what makes you likely to adopt your foster dog. Well, what we found is that if you were a new foster caregiver, you were over 4 times more likely to adopt your foster dog than those foster caregivers that had a prior relationship to the shelter. What we found is that 29% of foster caregivers that had no relationship to the shelter adopted their dog, and less than 7% of those that had some sort of prior relationship. So certainly being a new caregiver influenced your chances or likelihood of adoption.
Lisa, I think we have another question.
Yeah, I love it. Love questions.
Grace, did you have a question?
I run Second Chance Animal Rescue, and I think it's a valid question because what I see a lot of is people offering to foster on a trial basis, not because they're truly wanting to foster, but they want to see if it'll work out with that dog.
Absolutely. Well, more on that, Grace, because we have a bit more data on that that we'll be sharing. So I love that insight. That definitely tracks with the data.
Okay, because what we tell them in the very beginning is that if they are interested in the dog to adopt, that they should fill out an application now to get pre-approved because they have to go through the same process as everyone else.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
That saves a lot of time.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of resources there. We'll be talking just a bit about that in the wrap up.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so to dig in more about who were the folks that were adopting, we found that over 77% of dogs that were adopted by one of those new foster caregivers had no other dogs in their home. So you kind of put it together that these are, folks that don't have a relationship to the shelter prior to the pandemic. They don't have any other dogs in their home. It starts kind of giving us a sort of perhaps picture of who might be most likely to adopt if they are foster caregiving. And kind of, as Grace said, we might be able to help support people if they're perhaps more likely to adopt versus just caregive, and kind of more on that in just a second. Lastly, I wanted to chat about the role of resources. And so our team worked with each shelter to kind of understand what was the shelter's available resources. And we are the first to admit this is a very rough and ready number, but we wanted to know a little bit about how perhaps the shelter's operating budget and the number of animals that they were taking into the shelter the prior year, that might that have any influence or influence their decision making at all. And so we took those two numbers and we were then able to categorize shelters into 5 resource groups. And we use these 5 resource groups because it's kind of clear breaks in our data. And certainly we are the first to admit, right, that a shelter's annual operating budget, of course, isn't about just serving animals, right? That there's a lot of different ways that money goes to, and whether it's staff, whether it's outreach. So we recognize kind of the limitations of it. But we kind of were, based on this number, we were able to categorize the shelter as either being very low resource to very high resource, and those low, moderate, and high in between. So what did we learn? Well, when we took a look at the shelter resources and their foster caregiving, we found that very low resource shelters during the pandemic relied much more heavily on foster caregivers that had a prior relationship to the shelter. In fact, nearly 79% of all foster experiences that very low resource shelters reported to us were with a foster caregiver that had a prior relationship, right? So it's relying on those sort of foster networks and foster relationships that they had already kind of created before the pandemic. Conversely, very high resource shelters were recruiting more new community members, 60% in fact, to be new foster caregivers. So we see here that role of resources of the shelter can really influence how they recruit foster caregivers, well, likely how they recruit, but definitely who is participating in their foster caregiving programs. And lastly, we found relationships with the outcomes of the dogs and the shelter's resources. In fact, what we found is that very low resource shelters transferred many more dogs out of their facilities, while more resource shelters were rehoming them directly at rates of above 80%. We see that very low resource shelters, in kind of comparison, they got to that over 80% number, but they did it differently. They did it through a combination of adoption and transfer out. And you can see here with our graph that on the sort of left-hand side of the graph, you see the very low, low, moderate, high, and very high. And then on the top, we have categorized or color-coded the types of outcomes that dogs can have, from adoption, transfer, RTO, etc. And what you see here, right, is that very low resource shelters are just behaving differently. They're getting to the same outcome, the same level of outcomes that other resource shelters are, but they're doing it in a different way. They're using those transfer out programs much more heavily to kind of reach those sort of live release rates that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. So let's do our wrap up now. What are the takeaways then for our post-pandemic world? What can we learn about foster caregiving during those first 4 months of the pandemic that we can apply now? Well, the first thing is, definitely treat your first-time foster caregivers like trial adopters. As Grace mentioned and chimed in, I thought it was so great. We'll pay you later, Grace, that these caregivers, these first-time caregivers, are the most likely to adopt compared to folks that have been foster caregiving for you for a while. So, and if they don't have a dog in their home, it's even more likely to happen. So kind of think about that, right? That, I think we maybe have traditionally kind of put foster caregivers and trial adopters sort of maybe in different buckets and treated and provided processes to them maybe differently. And perhaps, that's not the way to go about it, that, people come to the shelter in a variety of different ways, and they're having their own experience and kind of probably determining if they're going to adopt. And perhaps then those first-time foster caregivers, maybe let them caregive or let them help us caregive by foster caregiving a dog that's already up for adoption, perhaps somebody that is a really good fit that they're interested in. Because if they're going to fail, they're going to probably most likely fail that first time. And so a little bit, I think, easier to, kind of thinking about the bandwidth and the resources it takes to provide training of our foster caregivers, which we don't provide to new adopters. Why not help those folks that are most likely to adopt their foster dog? Let's get them kind of fast tracked into more the dogs that could be trial adopted. And then, of course, if they foster caregive and then, someone else adopts a dog, then we can get them into training. But it's definitely a less of a burden on our resources. I think with our data, particularly about the success of trial adoption programs, with 3/4 of the trial adopters adopting their dogs, you've got to have a trial adoption program. That we now can see that with foster to adopt programs, or, if you call them temporary fostering programs, they're benefiting not only the, short-term welfare of the dogs, right? We know that they lower cortisol, they increase rest while the dogs are away, but now we have evidence that they are affecting the dog's long-term welfare, that they are helping dogs leave the shelter. And that's obviously, why we're all doing what we're doing. And when you think about those folks and adopters, I'm gonna stretch a little bit and say we have implications here for adopters, that if these folks are adopting or fostering doggos with behavioral issues, that we see that if they're being returned from foster care at a much higher percentage than doggos that don't have behavioral issues, we've got to be providing more support to these people. And whether that means, through our behavior department, whether that means individuals in the community. But I think that this kind of is some really good evidence. I think we would, in a perfect, probably ideal world, we would want to give support to all of our adopters, right? At that follow-up. I think it's one thing in sheltering that we're getting better at, and we need to get better at, but we're kind of spread thin. I think if we have limited resources, that follow-up should really be going to those dogs that are going out into homes that we know have some extra challenges and need some additional support. And the last thing that I'll share, and this is a bit in the paper that you can dive into, but what we found in our study, and this is correlational, so this is why I didn't get a very big emphasis in the presentation. But what we found is that when caregivers were allowed to do meet and greets at their homes and even directly adopt out the dogs from their foster homes, that reduced the amount of time dogs were spending in foster care, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? That if you We don't have to schedule this whole, oh, we have to do a meet and greet at the shelter, or I have to bring the dog back to the shelter to do the adoption. And we straight up let them, run those meet and greets, maybe not at their house, maybe they're doing it at a nearby park or somewhere else. But if they're allowed to do meet and greets, allowed to do the adoptions, we're seeing that reduces length of stay. And again, we have to dig in a lot more. That's a correlational finding, but it seems pretty promising and, sort of logical that those are ways we can reduce length of stay. So I'll wrap up that, these findings that I've shared with you all today, they represent some of the most detailed reporting to date about dog foster caregiving in the US. And I hope that those key takeaways I shared with you all about foster recruitment, trial adoption programs, caregiving practices, and behavioral support, hopefully they can really help you with your foster caregiving practices in this post-pandemic world, with, of course, the goal of improving outcomes for shelter dogs. So with that, I want to thank, of course, our shelter partners. We had just so many fantastic shelters working months with us on collecting data and helping us validate that data, that we're super grateful. And of course, my collaborators, what a fantastic bunch. I just love working with them. So the folks at Arizona State University, Rachel Gilchrist, Emily Blade, who's here on the call, Amanda Foster and Clive Wynn at Virginia Tech, Lindsay Isernia, Jennifer Reed, and Erica Pierbacher, and then newly at Michigan State, Rebecca Barber. And of course, our funder Maddie's, who we wouldn't be able to do this work without them. And we're super grateful. And with that, I'll take questions. And of course, you can always email me at lgunter@coastal.edu. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We do have a couple questions. Jessica, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question live? And
yes.
Awesome.
Hello. Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for all of your research that you've done all over the past decades. So can you go over the long-term impact with the welfare for this particular study? I don't know if I missed it, but I heard you say short-term. I knew the short-term about the cortisol levels from your other studies, but the long-term specific impact.
Yeah. So I think that, I guess what I was alluding to, and you can hear more about this next week at the ASPCA Research Forum, is that our findings as well, not only from emergency fostering, but through our work understanding the length of stay and outcomes of dogs that participate in field trip and sleepover programs, that we find that especially with doggos that go on sleepovers, they're over 14 times more likely to be adopted than dogs that don't participate in these programs. So I think we have some insights there. Field trip programs 4 times more likely. And then we have those outcomes of dogs that are getting foster care that I reported in this study, that we see that those foster to adopt programs are fantastic. Nearly 3/4 of dogs are being adopted by the folks that are trialing adopting them. And then also some of those adoptions, nearly 20% of dogs that are dog foster caregivers that are fostering dogs 8 weeks and older.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Hope that answered your question. I always sometimes am very circular and don't land on the answer. So I hope I got you.
All right. Our next question is from Renee. Renee, would you like to answer your question live?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Oh, great information. Thank you so much for sharing. I was just wondering if there was any follow-up data on retention for the dogs that were adopted in that time frame of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Man, I feel like this is an Emily question. I think Emily's allowed to answer. What did we do? I know, it's why I need to see. This is I'm just the one that likes to talk a lot. So typically I'll let Emily answer.
Oh my gosh. I'm unprepared, so that's fine. But so for this particular study, we were following the dogs for that entire 4-month period. So we would have seen if the pets were returned within that time frame. Mm-hmm. So that is going to be part of that. I don't know for sure that we were doing a longer term follow up with those, but Jen Reed is actually on the call as well. So if she has any idea.
So many of us, yeah.
I know, we're just all here.
Yeah, I would say that overall we weren't, that beyond those 4 months, we certainly weren't. And I think it's dependent on if the dog comes in during the 4 months we were doing the collection. I think that's always a huge question for us. And I love the question, Renee, because I think that it's a real like impactful question. And I think it's hard because, we essentially kind of, at least from my previous work on relinquishment, is that, we kind of see that there's sort of these two different sort of buckets that dogs fall in. Those immediate, it doesn't work. And then later on, when the dog is returned, that likely has a lot more to do with the owner. So I think we probably captured things that were probably related to the dog's fit to the shelter. But I think more long-term, we didn't.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
I do not see any hands raised or any other questions. I have one more question, and that's related to the data related to the behavior dogs who were more likely to be returned to the shelter during the fostering period. Mm-hmm. Yet only, so 5% of all dogs were still in the shelter at the end of the study, and the euthanasia rate was very, very low. Did you look into at all whether those behavior dogs that were returned for incompatibility with the foster home versus they led to a euthanasia?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I don't. When we said behavior, we left it like pretty, like, again, open-ended, that it could have been about the behavior of the foster dog. And that could have been towards a resident dog, resident pet, person, incident with a person that wasn't in the home, but could also have been related to the compatibility of other pets. And like I said, it was kind of hard to parse out. But then from there, once an animal was returned, no, we didn't look at, which I think is a super interesting question, like, were those animals at greater risk for euthanasia following a foster return for behavior? And I can't answer that.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. I want to know that too now.
All right, I think that is it. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Lisa. This was a wonderful presentation.
Thanks so much, Sheila. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.